Welcome to the show, Mitch. Great to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you being invited and am really impressed with the past guests you've had as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Been lucky to have some great people on, including you. Excited to learn more. As you probably know, if you've listened to this before, the way we really like to start this off is to learn a little bit of like how you first broke into the business and what that story looks like. I know that you started in graphic design, but also in ROTC. So would love to hear a little bit more of that and maybe how you got your first job or first company in the industry.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of, everybody's got kind of a unique path getting into this industry, and mine is no different. So really for my college career, I was on track to be a Navy flight pilot, and that was really what I was, you know, geared up for as far as all of my curriculum. And I was, on the engineering track originally. And so the creative part of the path didn't really happen until later. But once I got a little bit of production experience in college, I just found that to be really interesting. And I found that a lot of the creative kind of background I had from just doing a lot of drawing and doing a lot of, work in my spare time ended up being something that could apply to a career at some point. And so I did about 2 years in ROTC and did a couple different tours and really enjoyed that, but realized that it was really much more interesting being in the creative space instead of being at sea for 6 months at a time.
The chance to go up in the planes or the
Yeah,
jets?
actually, yeah, in fact, helicopters and guided missile destroyers and jet fighters were all part of the process. So yeah, I got to fly in an F-4 Phantom before they were
Wow.
decommissioned, which was really that was pretty exciting. And it definitely made me think twice about whether I should really go this creative route. But I think, once you kind of get that creative bug and get into production, that was the one thing that I felt really passionate about. So I kind of left ROTC behind and did a little more formal training in school with design. But for the most part, I got through most of that just being self-taught because I didn't go to an art university or school. And and it was interesting because all this work I kind of did on my own, that I would collect these drawings and I would always keep these drawings. And somebody recommended I just put them in a portfolio and show them to some of my college professors. And it turned out that after I got out of ROTC, I shared that portfolio with a couple of professors at the University of Minnesota. And I was able to test out of a lot of coursework and kind of get into finishing a major in speech and communications instead of engineering. So
Nice.
that kind of got me, on that path. And then I got really fortunate in an internship when I was a senior in college to work with a company where I got a chance to do set design and be on set for doing live action shooting and gripping and all the kind of things that go on in the studio. And it was great because that really set me up for what eventually was, you know, meeting a couple of new business partners within that experience, that we just decided, at 26, that we could probably do this ourselves and we could start
Mm.
our own company. And so we did that just probably about 2 years after I got out of college and I was
Nice.
finished up with those internships. So we just decided to, kind of take a big risk at that point, you know, get heavy in debt with the bank and with our parents and start building a production company.
Tell me how you met Prince and how this comes into your story.
Yeah, well, that one definitely, affected and influenced my entire career from, making that first meeting happen. And at that time, the company we had started with a couple other business partners had been doing, a lot of corporate video work and a lot of things that were, kind of low end commercials and just not a lot of big headliner kind of work. But it turns out that we are very close to Paisley Park. And the producer that we had worked with and the creative director we worked with eventually on Prince had heard of us and wanted to come and, take a tour, check out our facility, see what we did as far as editing and design. So yeah, they just had set up a meeting, came to our office, which, was just in a suburb of Minneapolis. And, you know, from that point on, that initial meeting, we started working on music videos. And at that time, it was Prince had just finished Diamonds and Pearls. So he was just getting into his Love Symbol album. And we just kept saying yes to everything they asked us for. And we did, besides doing the music videos and doing large concert staging and a lot of other things for them, it turned out that designing the Love Symbol was kind of part of that process. So I was really fortunate at that time to work with Satara Cheddar and Liz Luce from Paisley on that. And that just changed the entire trajectory of our company.
Wow. Wow. Everybody has to ask you, but how was he to work with?
Well, it's interesting because on the design side of what we did, there was, less contact with him directly because we worked a lot with his creative director, Satira, and part of her team. But we still had some connection on that work. But definitely when we got into editorial and especially a lot of the music video work or what was going to be used, like we're doing concert staging that was going to be used in Tokyo. So for those kind of things, they're really involved. And so he was definitely more present, at our facility. And, in all of those occasions, he was very quiet at that time. He wasn't as talkative as he was later in his career. So he was usually pretty quiet, but he was, really kind to everybody. Really, he's one of those people that I've said in other interviews, like when he's in the building, just everything feels different. You're inspired. There's just an energy of him being there that I think, was the most interesting part of that experience.
And obviously, like as a creative or as an artist, I mean, he's up there, right? So, in
Yeah.
terms of his sense of taste or like the way he gave feedback or anything, was he very particular or accepting or what was that you with him?
Well, I think, the interesting thing is he definitely didn't work on the same clock that any of us do, creatively or just literally. And, so when he was inspired, he would, we'd be working at 4 in the afternoon, we'd be working at 4 in the morning. You would never know. And you always had to kind of be prepared and be agile to, jump into a session, jump into a meeting, whatever it was, because I think in his process, it wasn't based on the same time chronologically that we all work with. And, so that's a big demand for everybody on our team. But I think for any of the alumni that have worked with him in some form or with his teams, because you know, there's definitely a very high bar and expectation for the work we were doing. So he's definitely very particular and we definitely did, you do a mountain full of work and out of that mountain, there's very little that we use as finished product. And that's because you're just iterating all the time. And it's probably something we all learned the most of that process was just the iteration and the speed that we had to work with. And so since so many of us are perfectionists, that was a totally different, a totally different way of working. And and some of the things that you held really tight, never saw the light of day, but the things that you would do at, 2 in the morning on a Sunday, was something that landed and hit and was finished. So you're just always working very quickly. And I think there's something very powerful with that. And I think,
Yeah.
that's kind of stayed with me my whole career.
Just move fast, create and see what sticks. But
Yeah.
also sounds like he maybe helped train you for the worst of the worst nightmare clients later in your career, probably.
Yeah, it's a really good point because I think, what it taught a lot of us is it doesn't matter if you're working on a, $100 logo or you're working on a $5 million project, you just treat them the same, and
Yeah.
you never really, it's a really good lesson and you never really know where something is going to lead. And, for all of us, there was no expectation of what we were doing at that time was going to have the legacy that it does now. But I think, you know, it, it really, it really set in that you had to give 110% all the time, no matter what the project was, because it could lead to something like that. And even whether it's a easy client or a difficult client.
Yeah. Always interested in the origin story, of the first entrepreneurial leap of our listeners are too, just how you started your first company. And I noticed that you mentioned that first company you were $2 million in debt, which is just like a mind blowing number. I mean, I remember when I started my first company, I took out a $10,000 loan, which seemed like a lot to me. But $2 million, and what was that feeling like when you were in that position?
Well, I think, it's such a different time too. We're looking back at, 1989, which was a time where there wasn't, we weren't even using Macintoshes at that point. So the entry level on systems that were, doing all the proprietary design, graphics, editorial, all of that stuff were very high ticket items. So you're using switchers and huge consoles for editing, and you're using, tape machines and digital hard drives, which at the time were much more expensive than they are now. And even the graphic systems and stuff were not, you weren't spending, on a mainframe of a Mac or something like that. You were spending, $300,000 on a dedicated paint box system, so all of that adds up really fast. And then also we decided it was really important for us to build a facility that also had a stage in it as well, because we did live action as well as design and editorial. So, we had, we're 4,000 square feet. We had, all this gear and equipment, machine rooms, edit bays, design bays. So it just, all of that at the time was just much more costly than it is now. So the point of entry was pretty scary, at the time. But I think, there's something about, having a couple other partners, at that young in their career, just kind of saying, we're going to go for it. And so we did all the things we needed to, as far as getting, the bank relationships we need, some initial, loans from our three parents, and then also, just getting a lot of buy-in from clients that would hopefully follow us and help us start the company.
Back in that day, a music video was $1 million. So you do two of those and you're break even, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's all, I think at that time, it was really important, cash flow when you have that kind of overhead and you're that small of a company. You know, that's the other reason why I'm saying that it was such a big change for us getting into that type of work, and then starting to be known for doing something that's at a much higher creative level, and just getting introductions to people that we never would have, had otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. And so, as a result of that company, I mean, obviously you moved on to other things in your career, but what happened with that? Did you break even eventually? Did that go?
Well, definitely not break even as far as leaving the company, because I was there 10 years, but we had another partner. We probably got to about the size of 15 by the time I left, but we had another partner leave a few years before me. So by the time I was ready to leave and I made my first move to Los Angeles, I had an agreement where I was able to get paid some after leaving, but with all the overhead and everything else we had, there wasn't a lot of money to be made, and it wasn't like we were going to be acquired by somebody at some point. But the amazing thing is, my original three partners now from that company are still running the company, and that's pretty amazing, just to know that, for a lot of the people that are working in Minneapolis or have actually made their way through the industry in Minneapolis have, had some tenure there, either as a designer or as an editor or in the studio. So it's great that they're still running it and it's still successful. But yeah, it seems like a long time ago now.
Yeah. Yeah. Same with me. My first company was a production company also, not as big, not $2 million in loans, but seems like ages ago.
Well, and I
But
think,
yeah,
and
it's
that's in the end of the day, that's really I think that's the great thing about that whole situation and doing it that young, is you really hope that there's a legacy of the company continuing, whether you're not a part of it or even some of your original partners may not be part of the firm anymore. So I just think it's really great that it still had that, that reputation and that longevity, which is really great.
and you've gone on from there to have a number of different roles, both in agencies, other companies that you've started. Um, probably won't get enough time to go through all those, but I did want to talk about the difference between being an entrepreneur versus an intrapreneur and what your thoughts are on that.
Mm.
And which one do you prefer at this stage in your career?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I definitely loved, as you probably did, being a business owner. And there's times where you didn't really like being a business owner. And I think, for most of it, all the hard stuff just taught me so much. And I'm super grateful for that. And I've been, an owner and a partner a couple different times. And I think out of those relationships, you just have a very different perspective on the business. And, it's so different than being an employee. And there's no way to really, explain it or have people understand it unless they've done it. It's kind of that simple. And so I think the interesting thing is what I really love to do now is be, as I am with Sibling Rivalry, be part of a company that is very open to having somebody that has those insights and has that experience and can share those stories, can share those processes, those experiences in a way that'll actually help them feel like they're not on an island, and they have somebody else internally that they can get involved in conversations and be part of the leadership team without actually being a partner in the company. And I really enjoy that because I'm not on the line the same way they are, as an owner, and I can be focused in the type of role that I'm doing. Because as you know, being an owner doesn't mean you just get to be more creative. So that's, I think with my role, I get to do the business and the creative parts that I really love to do, but I'm not as involved in what would be, a partner level role, which is, you're dealing with HR, you're dealing with, you know, bonus plans and health plans and office building leases and just all the other things that you're familiar with. And I just think it's nice having, separation from that.
Yeah.
The other thing is, which we do at Sibling, is I love that we actually hire a lot of former owners as part of the both the leadership team, design team, strategy team, because I think there is a very different perspective that they bring, but also there's just a lot more ownership in the process from some of those people. So I'm just grateful I've had, that opportunity, as you described it, as kind of an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Sounds like you're in your career more enjoying being a individual contributor, focusing on one piece of the business rather than having to see the whole puzzle of the entire business, which I can totally relate to myself in the type of work that I do nowadays as well.
Yeah. And I think, the one thing that's interesting about my role now is I'm kind of given the opportunity to work on like an ECD creative level, but I also work on partnerships and business development for the company, and then also PR and marketing. And so I think the combination of those three is so powerful and so important. And I think it's also how we do that differently at Sibling is because we actually do have visibility to all of those areas. And so I think, I still have a wide role in something that would be similar to what a partner, anybody in leadership would have. But I think it's just that, to what you're saying, that it's just not the same as being a owner of the company and having some of the responsibilities that come beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Love to dive in now a little bit to the process at Sibling and how you all do the amazing work that you do. I would love to get a sense of the scope of the content that you're producing in your role. How big is your team and what does that look like inside Sibling?
Sure. So we actually have two offices. We have a LA and a New York office. So on the New York side of things, we're just shy of 40 people in New York and just under 10 in LA. But the offices work it's very seamless. So I think for the most part, the whole company is working on kind of a New York timeline. So we start fairly early in LA, but there are projects that, whether they do originate on the East Coast or the West Coast or kind of anywhere in the world, we still share a lot of that between the two offices. So it's really not like they operate independently, which is really great. I think that's something we talked about really early on when I joined the company, of how we would make them very connected. So that's one unique thing I think about the way we run things. The other thing process wise that's pretty unique is we not only have a brand design and studio side of the business, but we also have a full live action and DJ director roster as part of Sibling, which is unusual in a lot of cases because we do collaborate quite often on projects, but there's also times where we're only doing things that are, films related and other projects that are just completely brand related. But I think the power of having those two available is really interesting for our clients. And it definitely, when we get into bigger projects, like especially on the branding side that involve brand films and a lot of content, for large clients like Arrow and HPE and Google and things like that, we can offer both of those services and kind of follow the project from, a beginning strategy point of view all the way through design concept, as well as live action shooting, as well as finish. And there's just not a lot of companies that can actually offer that entire spectrum. And I think that's part of, the growth that we're seeing too is a lot of clients that are looking for somebody that can handle as much as we can. And that's a big difference in the sibling process.
Got it. Just learn a little bit more about that creative process and like in terms of actual like tactics and process and strategy, how you handle that with your clients. May have something
Sure.
to walk us through and share. So if you want to do that, would love to check it out.
Yeah. We were talking a little bit about what we do in the Olympic process and for projects. And I think there's a lot of things that we do similar in that particular realm that we do for a lot of our clients. Let me just call it up here really quick. What I'd love to kind of talk about that's kind of unique about Sibling is just a lot of the in-person workshop process we do with clients. And that's from, you know, before COVID as well as after COVID. And now we're still really trying to push that as an engagement with as many clients as we possibly can. What I can kind of go through is some of the NBC Olympics work that we've done because I think that client, because we've worked with them for almost 10 years now, that part of the process is what always kind of brings them back. And then I'll show just a little bit of our engagement with a recent client because we also do it for strategy workshops as well. But when I talk through the Olympic work here, I'll just give you a little bit of insight into some of the things we've done with them, but also why this workshop process is so critical. So we've done, pretty much everything from 2016 forward, except for the Beijing Olympics, as far as the identity work with NBC Sports for the Olympic Games. So the most recent, which you're probably familiar with, is Paris, which you see on the right there. But
Mm,
we started this engagement with 2016 and a lot of this logo identity stuff. It's obviously really important to do a lot of deep research and do a lot of design exploration and include the client in a lot of this work. But the interesting thing is when we get through all of these identities, there's so much conversation that we have, even in the research process, which is kind of unique. So instead of going through that and presenting a bunch of results to the client of like what we're seeing for the Tokyo Games, we actually get them involved much earlier. So here's a little bit of Paris. I'll just show you some of the sneak peek of what you'll be seeing here in July.
wow.
And
Yeah,
and
The Tokyo one was so cool. And this is looking amazing as well.
thanks. Yeah, the great thing, and I'll talk about a little bit in the Tokyo stuff specific, is where we kind of, some of the things that we found, especially in this moment of it, I'll talk a little bit more about. But that's, I think, a lot of these workshops and actually having these engagements and conversations kind of throughout the process and in person get us to really amazing findings like this. But I'll show you just a little bit again of here's what Paris is looking like, some of the things that you'll see soon. But for Paris, for example, there's so much that we go through research. I'm just going to kind of show you just a quick dive. There's much less here than what we would go through in the first part of our process. But for time, I'll just kind of show you some of the things that we find in architecture, some of the things that we find in fashion. But all of these start to be influences that we start seeing between sports, between culture, and all of these things influence a lot of our discussions as well. And especially with Paris, a lot of the fine art was critical as well. But we curate and go through all of these categories and do a lot of the internal discussion. I think what's really critical is once we get to this point, and I'll go through the last part of industrial here, and then a little bit of the graphic design.
Yeah, this is so cool, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. And again, I think with the curation of this, we'll have hundreds of pages of this type of, but then when it gets to the workshop part of it, what we're really doing, and it sounds a bit old school, but it's kind of where I think we find a lot of these really great nuggets. And that is we take everything and we literally fill the walls with all of this content. We also have the clients, and these are the MBC clients that you see in frame here too. They bring a bunch of content and even sketches of things that they started thinking about from some of our initial conversations. And then we really sit down and look through all this stuff together. And literally, we have pads, pencils for iPads out and start going through just certain things that are starting to connect. And really, when you start seeing all of this research on the wall, you start making connections differently than you would if you're just looking through a PDF and paging through something. You really are kind of curating and visually making connections when you can see all this stuff in front of you. So for us in this process, I think that's where we start finding things that are just really unique. And one of the things which I was showing you earlier with some of our kanji symbols with Tokyo is that in these kind of things, you start finding elements that even weren't visible before, because a client is seeing that, this particular character in something that they've seen in kanji really connects to an idea that we originally had that we are just going to throw out, and since we put everything up there, everything is live and everything is available to us. So I think we start, finding those things that when we get to the final result and look back, so much of it is going back to some of those initial things we were talking about when we were actually in person.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And just to jump in, because so often in the presentation and the selling of the idea to the client, you're trying to show them, the influences and the reasons why you made those decisions. But this is incredible because you're bringing them into that entire process from the beginning.
Yes.
And creating it together. So you don't have to have that conversation with them, which I think is really cool. And I don't mean to interrupt your flow here, but I'm curious, like, how long ago did you start doing this and what sparked that idea? Did you just one day you were like, why isn't the client here with us in this brainstorming right now? Or how did that come about?
Actually, it's a really good question. That came up originally because we knew that the client was up in Stamford, Connecticut, and we were in New York at the time. And it was kind of it felt kind of like a big leap of, hey, would you guys want to come down for a workshop? Where we'd already kind of planned to do that at their location just as a test. And we brought it up and it literally just seemed like a light bulb moment with them. And they were just like, oh, well, actually, we want to come down to your place. We want to spend time with you guys. And we're going to take a full day to do that. And I don't think we've actually had a client, and especially at, C-suite level, say that they would come down and actually meet with us for an entire day just to talk about this work. And,
Yeah.
and that was kind of the first, genesis of it. But it was almost kind of thinking about, should we do this presentation in person? It was kind of, should we have one of these conversations about all of our initial findings in person? And yeah, that was kind of the catalyst of it. And we got so much out of that first version of it, is that's why we started also connected it into our strategy workshops and to, messaging workshops and things where we were actually getting their time and either doing it on site at their location or at our location.
Yeah. And have you expanded this out now to all of your clients? Is this part of your process or what does that look like?
Yeah, we really try to make that part of the process. It's really, even with the other one I was going to share with you, the stuff we're doing with Clearly right now, to get a CEO and get their time in a single day, even for a half day, seems almost impossible. But that's what was so great. We just did that recently as well. And probably one of the busier CEOs we've ever dealt with. And he still took almost 3/4 of a day, to sit down with us in New York and really go through this strategy workshop and kind of messaging kickoff. And it was so powerful. Like we got so much great stuff that would have taken us weeks to get through email and Zoom conversations and everything else, because it was a very active, in-person session. And there's just something about that that's different. And also everybody, it feels more engaging than when we do it over any kind of online or virtual experience.
Yeah. And CEOs love this stuff. I mean, if there's one
They do.
thing I think that CEOs get super passionate about is anything when you start talking about the brand and how it's going to be presented to the world, like, especially if they're the founder, the original founder. I
Yeah.
mean, I think they're just so passionate about this stuff. So it must be a great experience for them to be there with you for that day.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, and they just have fun, because obviously just like business owners, there's not a lot of fun in their normal day. So really to have an opportunity like this to really just be focused on it. And it's not that they don't have to be looking at their phone and don't need to be following up on things during the day, but for the most part, they're pretty focused with us. And it's, yeah, the moments that we get out of those conversations are priceless.
Yeah. I'd love to see the next client you were mentioning as well.
Yeah. And just one thing that I was going to mention here with the Tokyo mark that was part of those kind of conversations and where we just hit on like some really like what we called gold in that session is that we originally had heard in our brief that they didn't want to use any kind of brushstroke or any kind of traditional kind of kanji work um, from Japan in the original mark. But as we were talking about things and we were looking at sketches from the client that day and also things that we were doing, we found this moment that when the client went back and was talking to their parents who are actually Japanese, they had seen something and said, well, David, who is our client, that actual character that you guys are looking at, that's actually the human character in kanji. And, and there might be a really interesting connection with what you guys have already done there. And the interesting thing is for that particular Olympics, they were really trying to find a more human focus, athlete focus kind of foundation for the mark. So really to come up with something like that and then have that kanji character connect with the K in Tokyo was just amazing because now all of a sudden we not only had this foundation, but it was the center point of the mark and it actually had a real connection to not only the culture, but the heritage of
Yeah.
Tokyo.
Amazing.
But I'll go back. Let me get to the stuff we're clearly here. So with this, again, this was more of a client workshop, but what I loved about that, and we're really early on now, so we haven't even gotten into the creative part of things. But again, we were always concerned about having this larger office still in New York. But the one thing about that is that allowed us to, get our clients there, also give them an opportunity to, besides doing the workshop there, being able just to hang out and be part of our space for the day. So even if we don't have everybody engaged for the entire session, that some of those other clients can still stay and work and get a chance to meet our people as well and have conversations, have lunch together. But really that time of sitting down with founders and especially CEOs and other elements of the marketing group or also the sales group in addition to C-suite is just so critical because they really tell us a lot of things I just don't think we would get in normal conversation. And for a lot of this too, we're just, doing the really traditional stuff where we're getting all this stuff on Post-its, we're getting stuff on the wall. Again, kind of like I was talking about Olympics, when you start seeing all that stuff and we start making visual connections when all that stuff is up there and present, we just find different things. So I think, we're only in initial stages of this project, but again, we've already heard from, the CEO and the rest of their team how unique that was being able to do it in person. And I think we're already on a great track for, what we'll get into as far as our creative as well.
Yeah. I love the black and white candids too. Great, great capture. Love that. Well, this
Yeah.
is super cool.
Yeah, and I think and it's interesting because again, we were definitely doing this before COVID. And even as a team internally, we were doing some of this during COVID too. And we would try to do this in some virtual ways. But I think that's the big advantage now is people are looking for that connection. And I think even though we felt it was going to be harder to make that happen, it's been very successful, especially into this year of getting those things to happen and then seeing it as something that's really unique about our partnership with clients.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this. Thank you for taking us through this. So what are the biggest learnings that you've had in terms of process and tooling over the last 5 to 10 years?
I think, the biggest thing as far as process is just being a lot more connected to the client than we had been in the past. And what I mean by that is, instead of in our process having these big presentation milestones, throughout the life of a project or even kicking off a project, is we just do a lot more consistent check-ins all the time. So that can be tissue sessions where we're talking about ideas. That can just be really short, sharing sessions or question and answer moments that we're doing with the client. And even some of it is much more, simple and raw than that, where we're doing a lot of conversation, even via text or even via Slack channels where, there's just a lot more communication going back and forth through the life cycle of the project. And I think in that, we just find so much more success no matter what the project is, because we're able to think ahead more for the client in that case, and we're able to prepare for them better, especially with how much their schedules change, even on a daily or weekly basis. So I think we're just much more connected to them than we were in the past. And despite the remote world that we live in now, we're still doing in-person workshops and spending time with them, near the front end of projects on strategy, or even when we get into the creative and ideating point of a project, we're trying to get those sessions in their offices, in our offices, at a neutral location, because there's just something, the work is better when we do that. And also there's more ownership and buy-in from the client as well as from our team. So I think, that's that human part of the process, even though it feels, harder and more difficult to do now, it's still a big part of what we do.
That I love that. I think that good old fashioned sessions of just getting together in one room and throwing ideas at the wall and working together create the best work. So it's really interesting to hear that that's such a core part of your process.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean all the time that we can even get all the people we need to in a single room. So sometimes it's even a hybrid of that where sometimes we actually have people, remote, and whether it's Zoom or Google or anything else that we're piping people in, is I think it's just getting at least part of that in our process. And again, it's been harder getting that kind of fired again because of just how remote people are. But surprisingly, it's been really successful in this past year. And we just hope that, that can continue.
Yeah, absolutely. You've had a long and successful career. I'd love to hear just some of your general career advice. Like, what have you learned? What are some of the biggest takeaways that you've learned over the decades?
Really good question. Well, I think going back to the Prince thing, probably the biggest is just, the amount of effort and time that all of us put in is that, you can never just kind of half-ass it, I think, in the process. And it's really easy to do that for a lot of different reasons. But I think putting that strong effort into everything that you're working on, no matter what the opportunity, I've just found that, whether it's the Prince work or the Marvel work or the Olympic work, all of it is because, we came at it very enthusiastically and just put, everything that we had into it. And, that has just kind of paid dividends over time. So it's definitely not taking the easy way. on any of those things. So I think that, that was kind of a really early lesson. I think the other thing is just, every project we do, it's better when we're doing it with other people. It's never one person that's kind of like the rock star or the brilliant genius that is bringing everything together. It's really a team effort. So I think, especially early on, figuring out that you have to work well with people and you have to get along, you have to be kind, all of those things, you know, years later, make a difference not only in the project and the quality of the work that you do, but also in the relationships you have, the network you have with people. And then probably my biggest thing is I've just realized you have to kind of give away everything and share everything. So that's, resources, that's contacts, that's, advice and just your time with people. Because if you can eventually be that kind of hub, people to connect with and get recommendations from and get even technical advice on something, all of that will really come back to you, tenfold later in your career because people will look at you as being kind of a source for a lot of different things.
Yeah, I love that. Generosity and the reciprocity. So important in our field.
Yeah, it's really I did a podcast with Joel a few months ago talking exactly about that, the generosity, paradox. And it's so key that really the more you put into other people and the more you're helpful and generous, like that's kind of a secret sauce going forward because you get so much more back from people and from, you know, any of your mentees or anybody else in that process. It's really important.
So, few last quick questions here before we wrap up.
Mhm.
Most influential film you've ever seen or book that you've ever read?
Oh, that's really good. Well, I'd say it's two films. One, because it's a little bit earlier on, if you're familiar with Brazil by Terry Gilliam. And what's amazing about Brazil is just the practical quality of that film, whether it's effects or design or sets, because it was so inspiring on a number of levels. But I think there's a lot more practical applications of what I'll do in my past work. So instead of doing something that's computer generated, there's always a lot of shooting or elements that we're creating in a practical form that just make the process a lot more interesting. And and I think in that film, there's just some brilliant work by like Norman Garwood and some of the the production design talent on that film just is something that I've used forward throughout my career. Turns out, strangely, that first music video we worked on for Prince, he actually had Norman Garwood as his production designer on that. So kind of small circles. And and I think the other film is definitely Inception. It's my
Yeah,
favorite.
that's amazing. I've never seen Brazil. I need to watch that now. In this AI visual effects driven world that we're getting into, I think practical effects are going to become more and more important. So I will definitely check that out.
Yeah, and it's not just I mean, I would say in Inception too is there's a lot of, contemporary versions of what Nolan does that, share from some of those earlier films like Brazil. But I think what's also interesting is there's a lot of design involved in that as well. So I think even with our design work, we incorporate a lot of that, you know, practical in camera kind of effect in a lot of different forms. And I think it's just a different experience for our creatives, but it's also a very unique experience for our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Question, within the great advice you've already shared, but if you could go back to that 20-year-old kid, ROTC, graphic design, deciding where to go with your career, what would you give to him?
Actually, I'd say a couple things. One is because I was, since I was kind of self-taught and I was kind of more the athlete than I was the design or artistic kid, is like that's still going to be okay. You can find success, having a totally different path and a totally different past, I guess, because one of the reasons that I do the Olympics is because I actually have the athlete experience and the design experience of what's needed. So I think, that would have been something I wouldn't have realized at that point in time. And then I think the other part is just to, you know, persevere through those times as an owner, because I think you question yourself so many times, especially when you're younger, getting through that ownership experience and knowing that it's, it's definitely worth, powering through all of that and all the sacrifices that you kind of make, to build a successful company.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining. Great conversation. Appreciate all the learnings and insights you've been able to share with us.
You bet. No, I thank you so much.